Brian Entin was not out hunting for this twist. By every indication, it arrived on its own, carried by a source, a document, and a single detail tucked inside an investigative file that nobody had ever pointed to publicly. The moment Brian registered what he was actually looking at, the whole case appeared to pivot underneath him. Here is the part that stops you cold. In the weeks before Nancy Guthrie vanished, Annie Guthrie was not living like a woman simply enduring a family crisis. She was not parked by the phone, clinging to hope, or moving through the familiar heartbreak of a relative trying to stay strong while detectives worked at their own speed. Off camera, out of sight, Annie had fallen into something else entirely. A quiet and deeply private obsession that almost no one around her could see forming. Friends had no idea. Investigators had no idea. Even the people who were convinced they knew Annie best had zero sense of how she was truly spending her days. She had been researching something remarkably specific, something that swallowed weeks of her life well before Nancy ever disappeared. That project drew her into late nights, library runs, scrubbed search histories, and a handwritten notebook she kept isolated from everything else she owned. The people closest to her never saw it. The detectives on Nancy's case never saw it. Brian Entin never saw it either, at least not until a source walked him through what was recovered from Annie's devices, what turned up in her notebook, and what she had been quietly constructing while the public assumed she was just another grieving relative, counting down the days to an answer. But Annie was not counting down. She was marching toward one, and once investigators understood the subject of all that research, the case timeline no longer read the same way. To appreciate why that discovery hits so hard, you first have to understand how Annie Guthrie was perceived by just about everyone who knew her. Outwardly, she was none of the things that usually make a person look twice. No rumors of instability, no questionable inner circle, no history that raised an eyebrow anywhere. If anything, she was known for the opposite. The same words kept coming up whenever people described Annie: steady, private, reliable. The kind of person who handled whatever needed handling without ever asking for recognition. She was the one who showed up, the one who absorbed difficult things quietly, the one who never turned a painful moment into a performance. That image followed her through every chapter of her life. Her relationship with Nancy sat at the center of her world. It was more than family on paper. It had been shaped by shared history, loyalty, and the kind of pressure that usually breaks bonds but somehow made theirs stronger instead. When Nancy went missing, Annie was among the first people investigators questioned, and from the very beginning she looked fully on board. She offered up contacts, timeline details, and background on Nancy's routines, relationships, and habits. She took part in the searches. She spoke to reporters when it was useful and retreated when it was not. Week after week of an investigation that produced nothing, Annie held her calm, composed posture. That was the version of her everyone saw, and because it looked so effortless, nobody bothered to examine her more closely. What no one grasped was that beneath that polished exterior and dependable public face, Annie had already begun digging into something secret, not after Nancy vanished. Before. That timing is the hinge of the entire story. The review of Annie's devices was not opened because she was a suspect or even a person of interest. Investigators were simply sweeping through the phones and computers of everyone close to Nancy, hoping to find any digital thread that might clarify the bigger picture. Annie's devices were meant to be a formality. Instead, what first drew attention was the rhythm of her activity. Digital habits usually trace a person's day. Over time, usage patterns expose when someone wakes, works, rests, and winds down. Annie's pattern did not fit. The heaviest chunk of her activity was happening overnight, not once or twice, but steadily across several weeks. On its face, that could explain itself 100 ways: sleeplessness, grief, stress, insomnia. But once investigators looked at what she was actually doing during those hours, the mood shifted fast. The searches were not random or scattered. They were structured, deliberate, and sequential, more like someone executing a plan than someone drifting through the dark on a phone screen. Then came the deletions. Big sections of Annie's browsing history had been erased by hand, and not in the careless way of someone wiping everything at once. These were surgical. Certain date ranges were gone while others remained untouched. Specific sessions were stripped away while the rest stayed put. Cleanup like that signals intention. It signals a person who knew precisely what she wanted to hide and exactly what it could reveal. She had not wiped everything, which is part of the reason investigators could later rebuild so much of it. But she had scrubbed her trail carefully enough that it was obvious she knew a trail existed. She was not behaving like someone browsing out of curiosity. She was behaving like someone who did not want a map left behind. The phone records made the picture stranger. There were calls at odd hours and several numbers that matched no one in her known contacts. One number in particular refused to blend into the background. It was prepaid, registered to nobody, and Annie had called it multiple times over a 2-week stretch. Every call was short, under 3 minutes, more like trading quick bits of information than having actual conversations. She was in touch with someone she had decided not to save in her phone. Then there was the library. Across 3 weeks, Annie made 4 visits, something both records and footage confirmed. Before that stretch, she had not set foot there in years. She was not browsing shelves or reading for pleasure. She was requesting specific materials, including public records, archived newspapers, and court document collections. It is the sort of paper-based homework people do when they already know what they are hunting for and do not want every step running through a home internet connection. And then investigators found the notebook. It sat in a desk drawer at Annie's residence, not dramatically hidden, which in some ways made it even more disturbing. Either she thought it looked ordinary enough to go unnoticed, or she simply never got the chance to relocate it. Inside were densely packed handwritten pages. Dates, names, abbreviations, locations, arrows, question marks, circled entries. This was no casual collection of thoughts. It was the working file of someone running a serious investigation of her own. What Annie had actually been researching dragged the case from strange into something far darker. One of the first threads revolved around property records. Annie had been pulling ownership documents on a particular cluster of remote rural parcels, the kind of land that never draws attention, because there is nothing visibly interesting about it. No operation on it, no public significance. Just acreage held quietly under names on paper. But Annie had not gathered those records at random. She had pulled them in an order that revealed she was chasing a chain. One owner led to another, one transaction pointed to the next. Investigators could see her tracing a web that would have been invisible if each document were examined alone. When they ran the names she had flagged, what came back demanded a much closer look. Still, that was only one layer. Annie had also been digging through newspaper archives from years before Nancy's case ever existed. She was not studying current coverage. She was excavating older reporting from an era that predated the disappearance entirely. The dates she requested were so exact that investigators concluded she must have already had a reason for targeting them. She was not fishing for possibilities. She was trying to confirm something she already believed. Another thread surfaced in a document recovered from Annie's devices, one that had slipped past her deletions. It contained a list of GPS coordinates, arranged in a way that suggested they had been copied from elsewhere rather than generated on her own. Investigators checked every location. They were remote, off-road spots, not the kind of places anyone stumbles across in everyday navigation. Several lined up with the same properties Annie had been tracking through ownership records. Others matched locations that had flickered into view during the earliest phase of Nancy's disappearance, and then faded away unresolved. That alone was hard to explain. Annie had been mapping something before Nancy vanished, and the geography she was assembling overlapped with Nancy's case in ways that should not exist if the two had nothing to do with each other. Then there was a name, not Nancy's, not anyone immediately familiar from the investigation. It showed up again and again in Annie's notebook, circled, underlined, repeated across multiple entries and multiple dates. Investigators ran it and found that it connected to one of the property chains Annie had been following. It also connected to one of the archive dates and to the financial records she had been collecting. It was one of the central wires tying her entire project together. The financial records were another major pillar. Annie had pulled public court filings, litigation documents, bankruptcy records, the entire administrative paper trail that most people never even know exists. She knew exactly where to look. She printed documents linked to that recurring name and marked them up by hand, circling figures, drawing lines between entries, jotting notes in the margins. She was following money, and wherever that money led, she was convinced it mattered. Perhaps the eeriest detail of all was the stack of satellite images. 11 high-resolution printouts from publicly available mapping tools had been found, every one marked by hand. Annie had traced access routes, highlighted structures, and circled areas that appeared to show ground disturbance. At her own kitchen table, she had been using open-source tools to conduct what looked like remote surveillance of places attached to the coordinates, the properties, the money, and the name she kept circling back to. When investigators laid Annie's research out in chronological order against the weeks before Nancy's disappearance, the sequence rewrote how everything read. 3 weeks before Nancy vanished, Annie began pulling property records. The first ownership change she followed led to a parcel about 40 miles outside the search zones investigators would later establish. She cross-referenced the owner's name with court filings and found it tied to an old financial dispute involving a company that had dissolved years earlier. That was the first time the name appeared in her notebook. The next day, Annie went to the library and requested archived newspaper editions tied to a local story from years before, a story with no obvious public connection to Nancy, Annie, or their lives. The mere fact that Annie knew exactly which dates to ask for suggested she already had a thread pulling her there, whether from her own earlier legwork or from someone feeding her information. Then, in the early morning hours, the GPS document was created. File metadata placed it somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, proof that Annie had stayed up assembling coordinates gathered from sources investigators still cannot identify. By then, she had moved past suspicion and into mapping. The following day, she printed all 11 satellite images and started annotating them. By mid-afternoon, phone records showed her driving in the direction of one of those mapped areas. There is no record that she stopped there, but she went that way. The day after that, she spent hours pulling financial filings from public court databases, linking the property owner to a second name that had not previously appeared in her notebook. That evening, the second name finally showed up, circled and connected to the first. Then came a short call to the prepaid number. It lasted only 90 seconds. Annie made no notebook entries that day, suggesting whatever was exchanged stayed in her head. The following Monday, her digital activity nearly vanished. No major searches, no file movement, no library visit, just 3 days of silence. And on Thursday, Nancy Guthrie disappeared. That means Annie's research, the names, the coordinates, the properties, the money, and the map she had been quietly building, was already complete before Nancy vanished. On its own, that creates a chilling question investigators have still never cleanly answered. Did Annie know something was about to happen? Did she get close to an answer but fail to act in time? Or did her research somehow set something in motion she never foresaw? The smaller details only make the case more dramatic. Investigators found a gas receipt in Annie's car from the Thursday of the week before Nancy disappeared. The same day, Annie had driven toward one of the mapped coordinate locations. The station sat about 50 minutes from her home and directly along the route toward a place she had already studied through satellite images. There are no notes tied to that date, only the receipt, a timestamp, and the uncomfortable suggestion that she went there and came back without ever writing down what she found. Then there is page 19 of the notebook. Most of the pages around it were dense with writing, but page 19 was almost bare. It contained a date, an address, a time, and one additional word beneath them that investigators have not released to the public. The date on that page was the very day Nancy disappeared. The time was early morning. The address had not appeared anywhere else in Annie's research. Investigators went there, and Brian Entin later confirmed through a source that what they found opened a separate investigative thread significant enough to stand on its own. There was also an unexplained call made 11 days before Nancy vanished. This time it was not to the prepaid number, but to a business line connected to a company that had officially dissolved 2 years earlier. The call lasted 1 minute and 40 seconds. Investigators tracked down everyone linked to that company, and no one admitted to taking it. A fragment of a deleted email added still more mystery. Forensic recovery showed that Annie had composed and deleted a message within the same session. The recipient address was only partially recoverable, but the domain fragment matched an entity tied to the same financial records she had been studying. At some point, Annie had reached out directly to someone inside the web she was mapping. Whatever she wrote has never been recovered. Later, investigators uncovered a storage unit not near Annie's home, registered under a name that took time to connect back to her. Inside, they found what amounted to a second archive, including printed records and an earlier notebook that pushed the timeline back by months. Annie had been researching this far longer than anyone originally believed, and she had kept supporting material off-site. A backup like that suggests fear, or at the very least a worry that the primary record could be lost. Brian Entin has spent weeks chasing this story from the ground, often moving alongside the official narrative rather than through it, leaning on sources willing to talk off the record even when the investigation itself would not confirm the same details publicly. One former neighbor told him that Annie's routines had changed in the months before Nancy disappeared. Lights stayed on late. Her car was sometimes gone before dawn and back before most people were awake. Their usual easy conversations became rarer, and Annie seemed distracted in a way that looked, in hindsight, less like stress and more like active preoccupation. Brian also spoke with a local official who has direct knowledge of the investigation but remains unidentified. According to that source, the storage unit discovery shifted the internal understanding of the timeline in a major way. The earlier notebook made clear that Annie had started her research months before Nancy vanished, which meant she was not reacting to the disappearance at all. She had been digging before there was even an official case. A longtime friend of Annie's, speaking anonymously, told Brian that Annie once raised a strange question in conversation during those final months before Nancy vanished. She asked, almost casually, What a person should do if they knew something was wrong but had no proof. At the time, it sounded hypothetical. Looking back, it no longer does. Brian also talked with a researcher experienced in the kind of public records Annie had been using. That person said the sequence of records Annie accessed suggested sophistication, not guesswork. She moved through databases efficiently and pulled specific documents in a way that looked either practiced or guided. That raises its own urgent question. If Annie was not working alone, who was helping her? As usually happens with a case this layered, the internet has rushed in with theories. Reddit users have seized on the second name that surfaced in Annie's notebook after the financial filings. In thread after thread, many argue that the two circled names represent not a property transaction, but two sides of a relationship, one individual visible and another hiding behind them. In that theory, Annie had identified the middle layer and was working toward whoever sat behind it. On Facebook, the conversation has leaned heavily into crowdsourced records work. One group dedicated to the case has tried to replicate Annie's research using the limited public details available. Members believe they have identified the cluster of properties she was tracing and have posted overhead images they claim show more activity in that area than official records suggest. Investigators have not publicly addressed those findings. YouTube commentators, meanwhile, have locked onto the storage unit. Several of the most watched videos argue that the earlier notebook changes the entire story because it suggests Annie possessed information no one else in the investigation had at that stage. One especially popular take insists the real question is not what Annie was researching, but who told her to begin. And then there is the local rumor mill, which has produced yet another claim, one still entirely unverified. According to chatter in the area, Annie may have been seen meeting with someone from outside the region in the weeks before Nancy disappeared. Brian Entin has neither confirmed nor fully dismissed that possibility. At the center of all this debate, four broad theories keep resurfacing. One holds that Annie uncovered something about Nancy's life that Nancy herself did not fully understand and was trying to protect her. Another holds that Annie identified a dangerous third party whose connection to Nancy predated the disappearance. A third suggests Annie may have been working from information quietly supplied by someone inside the official investigation. And then there is the possibility that Annie's research and Nancy's disappearance are related only by overlap, tied to the same subject matter, but not to the same cause. None of those explanations has been confirmed, and none has been eliminated. Then Brian Entin's reporting took the kind of turn that changes everything. Until that point, the public assumption, and to a real extent the investigative assumption, was that Annie had been building toward a person. The notebook, the names, the money trail, the records. All of it seemed aimed at an individual or group sitting at the center of whatever she was uncovering. But according to a source close to the investigation, that reading was wrong, or at least incomplete in a way that fundamentally reshapes the case. The earlier notebook, the one recovered from the storage unit, showed that Annie's earliest entries were not built around a person at all. They were built around a location, more specifically, a location with a documented history, a place tied to events that had taken place years before Nancy disappeared. Those events had been investigated at the time and closed without resolution. In the years that followed, the property changed hands multiple times, and Annie appears to have read that ownership pattern not as normal movement but as deliberate concealment. In other words, Annie did not start with a suspect. She started with a place where something had happened, a place someone had seemingly worked to bury in paperwork, ownership transfers, and distance. And that place connected not directly to Nancy, but to someone in Nancy's orbit from years earlier. someone whose relevance had never been examined because no one knew there was anything there to examine. Annie found that link. She followed it, she documented it, and what she appears to have been building was not a theory about who took Nancy, but why someone would want to. The answer, if Annie was right, existed long before Nancy vanished. It was historical, it was buried, and it may explain gaps the official investigation still cannot close. Brian Entin is still working to verify the full meaning of that location and how it connects to the present case. What he has confirmed is that once investigators realized the location, not the person, was Annie's starting point, their internal understanding of her research changed significantly. The people involved may matter, but the place is where the story begins. Then came the latest shock. 2 days ago, Brian received a document from a source he is not naming, through a channel he is not disclosing. What he has said publicly is that the document came from outside the official investigation, and that its contents were checked against known facts through multiple independent verifications. It is only 1 page long, but according to Brian, that page contains 4 explosive elements. The first is a name, one not publicly linked to the case before and not among the names already appearing in Annie's notebook. When Brian checked it, the name did not immediately connect to the known record of Nancy's case. But it did connect to the location Annie had been researching, the same place with the hidden history and the suspicious ownership trail. And that connection appears to reach back even further than the events Annie herself had traced. The second is an address. The very same address written on page 19 of Annie's notebook, the page marked with the date of Nancy's disappearance, the time, and the undisclosed word. It is the same address investigators visited when they opened that separate thread. The third is a date, and not one from the past. It is a date that had not yet arrived when Brian received the page, a date falling inside the next active investigative window. Whoever sent the document seems to believe something either will happen or must happen by then. The fourth is a photograph. Brian has been careful not to describe it in detail. What he has said is that it shows a location, and that people following this case closely would likely recognize it. He has also said that seeing it made Annie's secret research make sense to him in a way it had not before. It made him understand why she kept her work hidden, and why she may have been afraid to bring what she knew to the people around her. Brian has not claimed to know exactly what it all means yet. He has not said where the case goes next. What he has said with certainty is that Annie Guthrie found something real. She spent weeks documenting a connection between Nancy's world and a buried history that predated the disappearance itself. Whether the document Brian now holds is the missing piece that finally ties that hidden history to Nancy's fate, or whether it is simply another deeper layer in a mystery that keeps folding inward, remains unanswered. But one thing is undeniably true now. Investigators are closer than they were before, and so are we.